Good evening, everyone. It's my great pleasure to thank all the senior officers from the central government, state government, and district officials who have gathered here virtually to attend this webinar on disseminating the behavior change thematic report. On behalf of DMEO, Development Monitoring Evaluation Office, and from Nithyayog, I welcome you all once again. Development Monitoring and Evaluation Office is an attached office of Nithyayog, which aims to fulfill the mandates to actively do the monitoring and evaluation of various programs so as to strengthen the impact of government's development interventions. As part of this mandate, Development Monitoring Evaluation Office has conducted evaluation of more than 125 centrally sponsored schemes of the Government of India from August 2019 to February 2021. Apart from the scheme evaluation, the evaluation findings of these 125 centrally sponsored schemes were leveraged for a thematic analysis of 12 different themes, including behavior change, accountability and transparency, use of IT and technology, gender, research and development, and others. I'm also glad to inform you that many of these reports have been finalized and have been uploaded onto the DMEO's website for easy reference. These reports, basically these thematic reports, provide a synthesis of finding from the 125 centrally sponsored schemes relating to gender, relating to behavioral change. And the importance of these reports is that it provides an insight into how the scheme designs can be done better to create better impact. So today we are going to have a detailed discussion about the behavioral change. As we all know, unless until there is strong behavior change, many of the development impacts cannot be sustained. And hopefully during this presentation and through the outstanding panel that we have, we'll have a lot more insights about it. As far as this report is concerned, Development Monitoring Evaluation Office and the Behavioral Insight Unit of Nithyayog joined hands to analyze the findings from 125 centrally sponsored schemes from a behavior change lens and came up with this publication of a behavior change thematic report, which is also uploaded onto DMEO's website. The aim of this webinar is to sensitize or to explain the findings to officials on the behavior change thematic report from the perspective of what are the lessons that we can learn in terms of ensuring quality at entry. Quality of entry is about designing a good program and having strong implementation. So that the programs are executed with effectiveness and efficiency, and ensuring that behavior change is adequately addressed as part of the design and implementation is very critical. The study identified behavior change approaches currently being adopted by Government of India and areas of opportunities it leaves for policymakers in India to integrate behavioral science in a more rigorous manner. It brings also global best practices which are relevant to Indian context. I really want to thank Behavioral Insight Unit of Nithyayog for doing an outstanding job in improving the quality of the report and also bringing very, very cutting edge sciences relating to behavior change into the report. And I strongly recommend everyone who has joined this conference call webinar to please download the report and keep it as an important reference material. Without much further ado, let me now introduce the key panelists here with us today. Our first panelist is my colleague from Nithyayog, Shri Rakesh Ranjan, who is an ex-IPS officer from Tripura, who has been the major force behind the aspirational district program, which he has been managing as mission director. And he has done a lot of interesting work, but also He headed the Behavior Change Unit at NITI. He established it and also has used many of these behavior change dimensions in the aspirational district program. And we look forward to his insights during the panel discussion. We are also extremely pleased to have on our panel Dr. Pavan Mamidi, Director of Center for Social and Behavioral Change at Ashoka University. He is a global expert on behavioral sciences, and in fact, the Behavioral Change Behavioral Insight Unit of Nithyayog has very strong relationships with the Center for Social and Behavioral Change Unit of Ashoka University. So I also take this opportunity, Dr. Pavan, to thank you and also place my record of appreciation for your team who have really supported us on this study. The agenda for our meeting is as follows. We will first have a presentation by Dr. Shagata Mukherjee, lead of Behavioral Insight Unit of Nithyayog, on the findings of the Behavior Change Thematic Report. After this, this will be followed by a panel discussion. As I said, Dr. Shri Rakesh, Ranjan, and Dr. Pavan Mamidi, which will be moderated by Sanyam Kapur, who is the monitoring and evaluation lead in DMU. Thereafter, we will open up for question and answers from the audience. Again, with this, let me once again thank all the central, state, and district officials who have joined, our esteemed panelists, and the DMU team, team members who are joining this event. I wish this event a great success. With this, I now request Dr. Shagata Mukherjee to start his presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bono. I'll share my screen. Is it visible?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. So let's start on the presentation of the work we did together, which is the Behavior Change and Public Policy Report. So the agenda for this talk will be the following. I'm going to quickly introduce the Behavioral Insights Unit of India, then talk about behavior change, and then go into specifically about the report on the behavior change in GOI schemes that we did. And I'll talk about methodology of our work, the key findings, and the key recommendations. So that's the plan. So quick introduction to the Behavioral Insights Unit of India at NITI Aayog. So in 2019, NITI Aayog, the Center for Social and Behavior Change at Ashoka University, and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation came together to form the Behavioral Insights Unit of India at NITI Aayog, which is housed at NITI. And in 2021, we moved to the CEO's office at NITI, and that is where we are right now. And that's when we started collaborating with DMEO, and we started working on this report. Our mission at the BIU is to strengthen policy design and implementation in India by infusing a deep understanding of human behavior across every level of the government, not just at the central level, but also at state level, district level. And our vision is to establish a network embedded organization within the government of India that enhances policy design and implementation through rigorously tested behavioral interventions. So basically, our overarching objective is to institutionalize behavior science in policy making in India. And to that, there are certain core functions that we perform at the Behavioral Insights Unit. The first is the behavioral and policy research, and this report falls as part of that work. The second is where we design behavioral interventions and we test them through field experiments, randomized control trials, etc. And the third is then we scale up the successful interventions with key stakeholders. And at the same time, we do capacity building on behavioral science, expertise within the policy ecosystem. So now I'll do kind of go over an introduction to behavior change overall, to set the context of what we have done in the report. So why behavior science? And as Dr. Gonu mentioned, this report looks from the lens of behavior science, the analysis of the schemes. So behavior science has now been recognized really important in understanding how human beings think and make decisions. So the core principle to that, of course, there's a lot to discuss in behavioral science, but the very kind of core principle to that is the idea of two cognitive systems, which is called System 1 and System 2. And this is the credit of this work goes to a legendary behavioral scientist, the Nobel laureate Dr. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. So they came up with this, and the idea of these two systems is that there are these two systems: the automatic system and the reflective system. So the automatic system is uncontrolled, effortless, associative, fast, unconscious, and skilled. Whereas the reflective system is controlled, effortful, deductive, slow, self-aware, and rule-following. Now, it is important to understand that it's not the case that some of us are System 1 and some of us are System 2. It is the case that all of us are both System 1 and System 2. Sometimes our System 1 takes over, sometimes our System 2 takes over. So it's like if we are playing football or we are dancing, we are using our automatic system, that is the System 1. Whereas if we are taking a maths test or we are writing a report, we are using our System 2, which is the reflective system. Now, what is the implication of this into policy? Now, many of you have read the Economic Survey of India 2019. And if you recall, the second chapter of the Economic Survey of India 2019 had this graph, which is here on this slide. And this kind of simple diagram categorizes the different policy instruments that policymakers have and placing them on a spectrum of policymaking based on their influence in behavior and also their freedom of choice. So to the very beginning, to the left is this idea of laissez-faire, which is the state with no direct government involvement and people in the society kind of having the maximum freedom of choice. The second is this idea of nudge, which directly comes from the discipline of behavior science, what I was talking about before, System 1 and 2. So what are nudges? Nudges are instruments that gently steer behavior in a particular direction while preserving people's liberty to choose. So nudges are means of guiding behavior or influencing behavior, but without mandating. And they do so by altering the choice architecture, which is just a fancy term for the context in which we make choices, without forbidding any options or significantly changing the economic incentives. And nudges are particularly effective when people fail to follow their intentions or when there's a gap in knowledge to form those intentions. So that's the second. The third is incentivize. This is the standard policy tool that all of us are aware of. So things like taxes, subsidies would fall under this, incentivize. And the fourth is mandate, which is, for example, an outright ban on something. So let's take one particular behavior to see this four policy instruments and how they might actually operate in our lives. So let's take the habit or the behavior of smoking. So in a laissez-faire situation, there would be no government direct action. The policy action there would be actually no action, right? So it would mean that people are free to smoke and there are no restrictions. What would be a nudge in this case? If you have ever taken a pack of cigarette in your hand, you would see that there are these pictures that are there on the cigarette packets, and those pictures are quite horrendous pictures actually, and they show what would happen to your organs if you smoke. And if you look at them, they are very scary. The idea is that if you look at these pictures, they would steer the behavior away from smoking. That if you look that this is what's going to happen to yourself if you smoke, then you are going to put the cigarette packet back and not smoke. But at the same time, it's not mandating your behavior, which means you can simply choose to ignore those pictures and smoke. Most smokers actually do that. They see those pictures and they choose to ignore it, and they continue to smoke. But for some people, that nudges them from not smoking. Right? You see similar kinds of videos when you go to the theaters to watch a movie and things like that. So that's the second one. What would be incentivizing policy tool in this case? That would be cigarette taxes, tobacco taxes, right? So that they increase the price of cigarettes, so they increase your cost of smoking, and the idea is that would lead to a less amount of smoking. And finally, mandate. This also we see. There is a mandate in India that bans cigarette smoking for people who are below of a certain age, right? 18 or 21. So that's a mandate. For them, it's just not legally allowed to smoke. So basically, you see just with one behavior how these different types of policy instruments can. So hopefully that makes it slightly more tangible. There are several frameworks that behavioral science uses for these methods. I'm going to talk about one of the earliest and one of the simplest frameworks designed by the Behavioral Insights Unit, the first Behavioral Insights Unit in the world, which is the Behavioral Insights team at UK, or also called the UK Nudge Unit. So they came up with this framework called EAST framework, and this is also the framework that Cass Sunstein talked about in the launch of the life event that was recently done. What is this? EAST basically is an acronym. E stands for easy. So the idea is many of the tasks and behavior that we have to do may take cognitive effort, right? Which is also sometimes known as friction cost. So by making it easy, you make a desirable action easy for a person to do by reducing several friction. So that's the idea, that if you want a desirable behavior, make that behavior easy to perform. The second is make it attractive. So people are more likely to do something when its value statement appeals to us or we draw attention to that, right? So if you want people to do something, make that attractive. If you want people to throw their waste in a bin, make the bin look an attractive looking bin so that people are drawn to it, right? It catches people's attention. So have bright colors or an interesting design, something like that. The third is make it social. The S stands for social. Now, people don't make decisions in a vacuum. There's always a social context in which people are making decisions, and a behavioral intervention therefore must leverage those social influences to enable an action. This can happen through social norms, social networks, social commitments, etc. And finally, timely. So due to a number of things that demand our attention on a daily basis, timing of intervention matters a lot. So making interventions timely is also very, very important. So that's the four things: easy, attractive, social, and timely. Now, finally, what is the behavior change design process? I'll take you through the process after the framework. How does it happen? How does this process happen? So it starts with the phase of discover, where you define a problem and you diagnose the problem, right? Where you try to find out what are the behavioral barriers for which citizens, for example, are not undertaking the desirable behavior that policymakers want them to. So once you identify those behavioral barriers, the second stage is design, where you ideate, in the case where you come up with a behavioral intervention. But it's not a one-time process, it's an iterative process. So you can sort of design it, then you iterate, you modify your design until you come to your final behavioral intervention design. Once you have your behavioral intervention design, then you move to the third stage, which is evaluate. And typically, the best way to evaluate, to find the impact of a policy, is through field experiments, things like randomized control trials. So, which is kind of the gold standard of evaluation. So that's field experiment, and where you do research with target group, you create a counterfactual or a control group that you compare against, and you measure behavioral variables. And finally, after your evaluation, when your intervention turns out to be successful, then you move to the final stage, which is scale up. You scale up the behavioral intervention. So these are the 4 stages: discover, design, evaluate, and scale up. So that's kind of the intro to the behavior change idea, the frameworks, and the processes. Now let me jump into the particular content of this report, how we have used this particular framework and this idea of behavior change in this report. So I'll start by talking about the methodology that we follow. So we had analyzed 121 schemes from 9 sectors. You can see these sectors: agriculture, health, education, skill development, rural development, urban development, women and child development, social inclusion, and water resource, environment, and forest and climate change. So these are the 9 sectors that we evaluated, all the central sector schemes and centrally sponsored schemes. And we found out that 32 out of these 121 schemes include the word behavior change in their guidelines. And this is a sectoral break for them. As you can see, agriculture 4, health 3, education 7, WCD 7, 0 for social inclusion, and water and environment. So then what we did was we followed several steps. We did a gap analysis of these 9 sectors, where we looked at these following sub-themes for behavior change. First is identification in scheme design. If behavior change is upfront in the identification of the scheme design. Second is there allocation of funds toward behavior change? Third is, are there specified channels mentioned to leverage behavior change? And the fourth is several challenges and impacts. So that's the process we followed for the gap analysis. We also did several secondary literature review, where we looked at external reports and media reports about the schemes as well. Of course, in the first case, we looked at the actual scheme guidelines, operational guidelines, and things like that. But we also did a secondary literature review about the schemes, and then we came to a scheme level finding. So that was the method we followed. Breaking it even further, we asked these several questions. In the first stage, in the identification and scheme design, we asked the question: is there a clearly identified behavior change or IC strategy included in the scheme design? In allocation of funds, we asked, are there separate funds allocated to behavior change activities under the scheme? In the channels leveraged analysis, we asked, are there channels identified to deliver any behavior change communication and or any behavioral intervention? And finally, in the challenges and impact phase, we asked the following questions: are there any documented challenges faced in the implementation of behavior change activities? And are there any documented evaluations to measure the impact of the behavior change activities? So these are the questions we tried to answer for all the schemes, one by one. So that's the overall methodology that we followed. And I'll now talk about our key findings. So, like other countries in the world, India is also transitioning in the spectrum of behavior change and getting more sophisticated about it. So initially, our idea of behavior change within the government was very restricted to IC and BCC, where we are now moving to SBCC, social and behavior change communications, because we understand now that any behavior change happens within a context there, so the social context needs to be taken care of. But there's still an opportunity to take another step forward and go beyond SBCC to a wider behavioral interventions, which are not just communication-based behavioral interventions. They include, of course, wider behavioral interventions include SBCC, but not just restricted to that. Now, but we have certainly made progress in India, because in 2021, when we did this analysis, as I showed to you, a total of 32 schemes mentioned the word behavior change. Now that's a big improvement compared to 2016, where only 18 schemes had mentioned. So we've almost doubled between 2016 to 2021, which is a good positive move. Now, this is where I'm going to talk about broadly what we found in our results. So, as I said, out of 121 schemes in 9 sectors, 32 schemes have mentioned the word behavior change. Now, out of those 32 schemes that we have analyzed, only 6 schemes have separate IC guidelines, and only additional 8 schemes have a separate IC paragraph or a section in the scheme guidelines. So a total of 14 schemes out of those 32 have some either IC guidelines or a paragraph on IC sections of the scheme guidelines. Now, out of those 14 schemes, as you go up the pyramid, that are focused on IC in one way or the other, only 6 schemes have allocated a dedicated budget to IC activities, and additional 3 have mentioned usage of administrative funds for IC activities. So out of those 14, 9 have allocated some form of budget. And then out of those 9, only 1 scheme have mapped the IC activities to measurable behavioral outcomes. So this is a very important thing for us to note, that out of 121 schemes that we have analyzed, there is actually only 1 scheme that have gone through this entire process and have mapped the IC activities to measurable behavioral outcomes. So naturally, you would be curious to know what is that one scheme. That one scheme is, it's not a surprise, it's Swachh Bharat Mission Gramin. That's the only one scheme that has actually gone through this entire behavior change process. So now a sectoral breakup of this analysis. Those of you coming from different sectors would be interested to know how their sector and schemes are doing. So here, first we are looking at the presence of IC guidelines or sections in the scheme. You can see WCD has about 45% of WCD schemes have that. Urban development does the best among all schemes here, close to 75. Rural development followed by that. Skill development, unfortunately, has 0. No IC guidelines on any of the schemes. Then education, health, followed by agriculture. Now, this next graph, this one shows the presence of fund for behavior change. So here you see that WCD, although had, if you go to the previous one, had about 45% of the schemes had IC guidelines, only about 30% have some fund allocated to them. The same is true for urban and rural development. In urban development, 75% of the schemes had some guidelines, but only about 50% of schemes have actual funds. Same is true for rural development. Skill development again has no funds. No schemes have any funds allocated. And education, health as well. The interesting thing here is agriculture. So if you look at this previous graph, about 25% of schemes in agriculture has some IC guidelines, but 0% of schemes actually have any fund to carry them out. So there is this gap between some sort of intention action gap even within the scheme designs itself, where they are in this journey. So now in the third case of channels leverage, what are the channels for behavior change that these schemes leverage? There are several channels. The major behavior change channel across all schemes is IC, followed by network of community workers. So the you can see the green one is the major one, that is media and large scale campaigns. So forms the IC activities. Media could be TV, radio, newspaper, posters, leaflets, wall painting, social media, any form that uses the IC activities. That's been the dominant channel so far. It could also, there's the other channel is large scale campaigns such as, Poshan Ma, Cycle for Change, Health Day, Rozgar Divas, etc. Then the blue one in this pie chart is training and capacity building activities. And then the other one right after IC is community workers leveraged. And here the community workers leveraged are Gram Panchayats, SHG groups, ASHA workers, Anganwadi workers, etc. So these are typically the different channels leveraged for behavior change. Media for IC, community networks like ASHA, Anganwadi, the frontline health worker network, SHG network, then training and capacity building. These are the three kind of main pillars. And finally, challenges and impact. As I mentioned, only one scheme, the Swachh Bharat Mission Gramin, has mapped the IC activities to measurable behavioral outcomes. No information is available on challenges and impact on behavior change activity on any other scheme, unfortunately. So that's a big gap that exists in completing, what we would like to know from here. So in the graph, you can see a report by Ernst & Young's on this mapping of Swachh Bharat of the IC activities, and you can look at the percentages here, where basically I think they did a household survey with about over 1,200 households, and they found things like toilet use at all times was about over 92%. Frequency of hand wash over 77%, no open urination over 75%, toilet use increased about 60%, use of sanitary pads about 37%, and proper disposal of sanitary pads about 32%. This data is in 2020 when this report came. Now, the final key finding in this is that what has emerged from our analysis is that self-help groups and community workers, particularly ASHA workers, Anganwadi workers, have emerged as most successful mediums for influencing behavior change. So that's a positive side to it. However, there is also something to note about this finding, which is that most of these schemes have only leveraged these existing community channels, particularly the SHGs and ASHA and Anganwadi workers. So we don't know if there are other networks within villages, within communities that could prove to be as effective, because those have not been tried out as of yet. And most of the schemes have gone through only these few channels, which have worked well. But it also means that the SHG groups, the ASHA Anganwadi workers, are overburdened because all the schemes are basically leveraging them for behavior change. And finally, our key recommendations from the report. The first is, so we divided into short-run recommendation and long-term recommendation. So our short-term recommendations, the first would be creation of a standardized method to identify presence of behavioral components in a scheme. Right now, that process is ad hoc. So what we recommend is having almost an SOP of sorts to identify not just what is the key behavior, but also who are the actors, identifying the key stakeholders in the process, etc. So for that, and that should be sort of standardized in a scheme. The second is for all schemes that have a behavioral component identified, separate IC guidelines along with dedicated budget may be mandated. And you saw in the analysis that many schemes didn't have IC guidelines, and then out of those which had IC guidelines, again, many didn't have a budget. And the third is for all IC guidelines, mapping of activities to measurable behavioral outcomes is desirable. As you saw, right now only one scheme, that's the Swachh Bharat, has done it, and other schemes should actually take that as a good practice and do the same by mapping the activities to the outcomes. And we also have several long-term recommendations. The first is a comprehensive map of levers of behavior change at a district level that may be leveraged by schemes as channel of delivery. This is to reduce the overburdenness on the frontline health workers and SHG groups, because all schemes are using the same channels, and at a certain point, there will be saturation. Then the second is model end-to-end behavior change process with templates and trainings for facilitating completion of each stage by different stakeholders. So there is a behavior change process that is institutionalized within these schemes. And finally, once all of these have happened, then advocating for higher budget allocation to behavior change. Even the schemes that have some budget, the budget is really, really low. So on average, India's average on behavior change budget for these schemes is less than 1%. It's 0.08%. To give a benchmark, the corresponding figure in UK is 12%. Right? So this, on average, schemes in UK spend 12% for behavior change of their fund. In India, we spend less than 1%. So there's obviously a lot of scope of improvement here to bring about behavior change. But I'll give you, this is kind of the overview of our analysis and what we have in the report. I'll stop here, and I'll echo what Dr. Bonu had said, which is I'll urge, or I'll hopefully this presentation nudges all of you to go to DMAO's website and NITI's website and download the report from DMAO's page and actually read the full report. There are many nuances in the report, which obviously in this short time of presentation I couldn't cover, but hopefully it gives you an overall idea. So I'll stop here. Happy to answer any questions. Otherwise, hand it back to Dr. Bo.
Thank you, Dr. Shagata. That was actually a very insightful and a very succinct presentation, wherein you kind of concised a lot of insights that we had in this report. So to begin with, I would like to thank you and the entire BIU team to specially cull out these valuable insights from this large extraction of analysis of around more than 120 schemes. So without any further delay, I would like to welcome our esteemed panelists, Shri Rakesh Ranjanji, Mission Director at the Aspirational District Program, Nithyayog, and Dr. Pavan Mamidi, Director, Center for Social and Behavior Change, Ashoka University. I would like to actually begin with one very keen observation that I had, and I think the audience as well as other members in the panel would echo with, which is that we have been seeing from the last decade that policy making, the world has increasingly seen an attention towards behavioral science. So I would like to pose a question around this to Dr. Mamidi, that so how would you like to describe the current global scenario of behavior science in policy making? And where do you actually see India lying on this spectrum?
Thank you, Sanyam. First of all, my heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Bonu and Rakesh Ranjanji for having me in this wonderful, wonderful panel. And of course, thank you, Shagata, for laying out the study very, very carefully and beautifully. Rakeshji has been the author of this organization that we call BIU. So, all gratitude to him. To your question, Sanyam, in terms of the adoption of behavior science. So there are two ways of looking at it. One is there really a surprise in behavior science? Right? I mean, I think the biggest surprise seems to be from the point of view of the history of economics. I mean, because economists structured human behavior as being primarily selfish, maximizing, and so on, whereas common sense would tell you that human behavior is not that. So the intellectual surprise that economists felt was not felt in other areas, and particularly in the policy area. So I do believe that policy has always had a behavioral dimension in it. It's just that they were not self-aware of it. It's just that it was not systematic. And I think with the advent of behavioral science, the application of behavioral science in a more institutionalized manner, people have become more self-aware of it. People have become more reflexive of it, and therefore they have developed very systematic processes by which they can bring behavioral thinking into their policy making. So in some sense, behavioral science itself moved from the systems one to the systems two that Shagata outlined. There is widespread adoption of behavior science globally, but having said that, there is one distinctive thought that I would like to share, and that is among the fundamental levers of change of human behavior, nudges really are fairly small. The largest weight is obviously carried by formal institutions. Law carries the biggest weight in terms of impacting human behavior. And then, you have social norms and so on. And then incentives, perhaps, through markets. And nudges is that sort of the silver bullet, the thin layer that comes at the very end. So I think the initial stages, globally speaking, people went through this excitement of behavior science in isolation. But now, increasingly, what they have begun to do is they've begun to look at behavior science from the point of view of its interrelatedness with other levers of behavior change as well. And that's one of the specific reasons why I think the Indian Behavioral Insights Unit at NITI Aayog was even called a Behavioral Insights Unit and not a nudge unit, because we wanted to become much broader than just nudges. Nudges are one way of looking at things, right? So as a Behavioral Insights Unit, the entity at NITI Aayog has a very flexible mandate in terms of being able to even think about law or think about social norms and see how, in a concerted manner, we can utilize all those perspectives in changing policy. So I think India has leapfrogged in the sense of being more wider, and that I think is a good thing. So I'm very, very pleased with where India is. I do understand that the numbers show a lot to be done, but we have started the journey, and we have started the journey in an interesting and in a very flexible manner and in a very strong manner. So I feel very optimistic about the application of behavior science in India and its potency to accomplish the goals, the huge goals that we have, the policy goals that we have ahead of us. Let me pause there and then perhaps let others comment on this.
Thank you, Dr. Pavan. And I think I do take that with the surprise that you mentioned. So the whole evolution of behavioral science and particularly adoption of it in terms of India, and thank you for taking us through it. And so with this, I think I would like to take the global perspective further to India, and then how we see that how it can be benchmarked for policymakers in our country. So as Dr. Mamidi has already shown a spotlight on the role that government and the policymakers play a role, and how in many ways policymakers work as architects for designing choices and social environment. So in this regard, I would like to bring up the discussion with Rakesh Ranjan ji, who with this very unique experience of being associated with the central government, NITI Aayog, which are actually very central to designing policy. Along with this, simultaneously, he has been leading a program called the Aspirational District Program, wherein he has worked very closely in coordination and in tandem with the state and the district government. So for this, we would like to understand your perspective that you carry both grounds on the role of behavior science in policy making and in policy implementation.
Yeah, good afternoon to all of you. And let me first thank the organizer and congratulate them, because I was looking at the list of the participants, and you see the overwhelming presence of people with a great deal of seniority. It is not simply that, and good number of policy makers are today there in audience, and I'm sure that many of you would be knowing and practicing the behavioral science much more than what even we can think of. So I speak with great deal of humility in front of all of you. Let me first underline 2-3 trends, because that is the fountain of what we are doing. That's the reason that why we are doing this. The first trend, I mean, any of you, a student of history of economics, would see, and of the government, that all over the world, there is a major increase in the government expenditure in social sector, whether it is a autocratic government, whether it is a democratic government, whether it's a good government, whether it's a bad government. But the percent, about 200 years back, the percent of the government budget used for social sector was very less compared to what it is. It's a very large trend, which is unmistakable, and this trend is there in every country. India is absolutely no exception. In fact, India leads in this particular remark. The second trend is that public are no longer docile. They want you to perform. They want, I mean, since All my colleagues are there in audience. I mean, I can see that good number of government servants from central and state are there. So public are not only aspirational, they have a degree of expectation and they want that everything should reach. The third thing is that public are not happy with the only aggregate. They want specifics. So if many children are going to school, that's fine, but when my child is not going to school, that's very, very unfine. That's quite bad. So with this heady mix of expectation of the public and all this thing, government, and there is an inner urge. That's also very important and missed in many discussions. There is inner urge in very large number of government offices to do actually very good job. I mean, you will come across. I mean, one of the things that we say is what keeps the bureaucracy very motivated. One of the things is that is the inner urge to do something better. Now, if you combine all 3-4 things, we will come to one very basic conclusion that if we are launching a scheme, we will like it to be efficient, first thing. First thing, we will have inner urge to like it efficient, and if we don't have inner urge, then public will make us to think that that we must be efficient. And the second thing is that we must not leave anybody. So as you are talking about saturation, the last mile, no one should be left behind. These are not simply political language, but these are the stories of our time. This is the expectation of our time. This reflects what the society wants from you. Now, behavioral science is something which, as Professor Mamidi, a great friend of mine, had very clearly explained that this is something which is there in the mind of everybody, but then to be seen as an explicit policy tool is something which we see a quantum jump in the world, I mean, in the governments in the world. And India, I mean, I would say we were slightly late starter. Well, we would have taken, because we have less money for government program and we want to reach many people. So we must be the first one to look into any tool that improves our efficiency, and behavioralism is one of them. So we must, but then whatever it is, even if we are late, but we are there and we have started this particular process. So I'm not surprised if you have 18 scheme in 2016 or something which looked and talked about behavioralism. Today you have 32 scheme or something like that. But then, I mean, if you go after 2 or 3 years, you'll find much more scheme. So fairly important in the life of this nation and in our quest to reach everybody is to see that can we change something which doesn't cost us more money? Because actually behavioralism doesn't cost money. It's one of the very, efficient thing to do, very small thing, but put it in a context of the society as well as in which we are living. And then you realize that the results can be very, very, very good. So not only that you improve the impact, but I will also make some difference here, because there are a large number of students also, I'm told that join this program. There is a common mistake of considering behavioralism as lack of awareness. No, it is not. In fact, the behavioralism starts when you are aware of things and you still don't do it. The second point, which is fairly important, is that good number of us think that behavioralism is for them, for whom we are supposed to do things, and it's not for us. That's completely wrong. The program that we have been able to put forward, and good number of district magistrates are the aspirational district program. If somebody says, what has changed this program? I say behavioralism of the entire people, including mine, including people who are senior to me, including people at the state government, including at the district administration, and including at the grassroots level. That you change the behavior. Because you see, after all, you have signed a contract, come to the government and said, I have to do this job. And you're aware you're supposed to do the job. But you still don't do it. Once you start thinking, oh, there's a ranking, there's a competition, and my worth is going to be seen. I have a good, if I do well, then the district will do well. My colleagues will feel happy. And if I do badly, my colleagues will say, oh, because of you, we have sunk. It is that which is changing the behavior of our person, of all our service providers, which is giving efficiency to the scheme. So the second distinction I make is that behavioralism is not simply for the people who you are supposed to govern or you're supposed to provide services. It is also largely for the government servants, for those who are there in the helm of affairs. In fact, they who are supposed to lead, and they are supposed to do a better job in better knowledge and better grounding in the behavioralism. And that is what it brings me to the fact that I'm very, very happy that we are looking at this day when there is an agency which is looking at 122 schemes, looking at the behavioralism. Today, those schemes on which you don't find even a mention of the behavioralism, will force them to think that, I mean, did I did something wrong in designing the ICE component of this scheme? Because I didn't look after the most important aspect of it, which is going to give me efficiency but doesn't cost me money. So I would say that time has come when all of us must ask this particular central question, that I want to improve the performance of my district, of my subdivision, of my block, of my country, and I have a tool called behavioralism. Now, there's something drastically wrong with me if I'm not going to use it. So I will stop here at this stage and see that how and what question come from the audience. Thank you.
So surely we'll take the questions coming through. But before that, I have a question further that's to both of you actually. So as you said that behavioral science is one of the very, very cost-effective interventions that can be deployed to actually increase the effectiveness of the schemes that we have deployed. In regards to this, I think actually application of behavioral sciences is not really a very recent phenomena, which has been ongoing, and it's not at all entirely new to India. I think communication and messaging, we have been very successful. We have had many successful things before, and some of them have actually used behavioral interventions, but primarily possibly have not been noticed as such. So we would like to actually pose this question to our panel, that could you cite any example about an effective application of behavioral science and that you have observed or seen in public policy? So this, so possibly Pavan, Dr. Pavan, you can cite it. Yeah.
Thank you for a great question, Sanyam. So I think Shagata has already answered this question in part when he made his presentation. The biggest success story that we can talk about in the application of behavior science in public policy is the Swachh Bharat program. And it's a happy coincidence that the author of that program is going to be heading, he's going to be one of the leaders at Nithyayog, Mr. Paramaiah. I just want to touch upon one critical point that Rakesh ji has raised, and that is behavior science starts where awareness ends in some sense. I mean, you need to be already aware of something, or you need to already have the infrastructure. And despite that, the behavior is not being accomplished in some sense. So Mr. Rakesh really started off with that point, and the question for him was, when we have the infrastructure, if people don't use the infrastructure of toilets, then what do we need to do? What is the software that we need to embed in the system in order to promote that behavior? So it's not, so the policy did not stop at the mere construction of the toilets, right? So the three principles which are actually identified in the report, the wonderful principles that Mr. Paramaiah incorporated into the DNA of this program are, the first one is pride, the second one is disgust, and the third one is love. What is pride? How did pride get embedded into this? So, the campaign messages that we saw, the celebrities, the branding, which indicated the sense of pride that people should feel and have in toilets and so on, was a sort of an emotional kind of a messaging that was deeply embedded in the program. So what is pride? Pride can be conceptualized as a positive, normative, empirical expectation from a social norms theory perspective, which was leveraged brilliantly by this program, right? So why is positive, normative, empirical expectations important? It's not sufficient to just tell people that something is good or bad. It's also important to sort of demonstrate that it is good and bad. And that's exactly what celebrity influencers, etc., did. And that's how it may have played a tremendous role in producing the movement. The second ingredient that was incorporated in this is the phenomenon of disgust. When you have, I'm told that they used campaign workers used a fly in a glass of water, and they would hand it to officials or whoever and ask them to drink the water. And when they refused to drink the water, they basically primed those people into thinking about disgust and how disgust then can be. It's a very powerful emotion, and how it can be leveraged in some sense to say that we need toilets in order to lessen the level of experience of disgust in our day-to-day lives. The third concept, which is love, revolved around emotional incentives. So, I mean, everybody has seen that really famous movie that came out from, in Bollywood, where, how a young man couldn't get a match because he did not have a toilet and so on. Sort of plugging away into the emotional lives of individuals and how that can play a role in changing behavior. So they used a couple of these really interesting levers in producing the necessary change to go beyond awareness or to go beyond the availability of infrastructure to accomplish the the objective. So this is one, of course, classic example. Swachh Bharat is our sort of prized example, but there are any number of hundreds of examples that also come from the countryside. The way, for instance, I come from rural Telangana. The way my grandmother, who was non-literate, who was blind, would settle a dispute among people in the village involved principles that I later learned, much later at Harvard University. They're called integrative negotiation tactics. And that is essentially a behavioral tactic. So it's not as if behavioral interventions and the application of behavioral science did not already exist, but it's just that we started becoming deliberately conscious of the existence of these principles and then systematically start using them. So Swachh Bharat would be my favorite example to cut a long story short, to indicate that we have already our journey in behavioral science actually started much before even NITI. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. In fact, I would also like to mention one of the interventions, which is very unique that I saw, and it's from a block called Charthawal in Muzaffarnagar, Uttar Pradesh, wherein they were actually promoting like campaigns around immunization. So they wanted to have a lot of traction within places. So which is very unique. We saw that they utilized akhada, wherein a lot of people come for these championship of boxing. So they kind of spread the message there because you would see a lot of traction in those areas. So that was something very unique that I observed, wherein they were actually deploying a behavioral science to utilize and capture that crowd as well. So that's one. On top of it, I think I would also want to ask the panel and probably Rakesh and Ranjan ji to cite any short-term, low-hanging fruit which he observed as that the states and districts can address, or also the center can address using behavior science, something that's low-lying and short-term.
So let me take compliment from what Professor Mamidi has.
Sir, you're not audible.
Yeah, I will. First thing is that I entirely agree with Professor Mamidi. Am I audible now?
Yes.
But I would always come back to my earlier theme, where, because in audience there are a large number of government servants, I'm pretty senior one, is that when you look at the strategy of NITI Aayog and also of aspirational district program, is that where you look into the ranking and naming and shaming strategy, and I always say that the persons whose behavior are required to be, or who would gain a lot if the behavioral change, is also those who are the people who are delivering the services and not simply the member of the public. One of the aspects which I touched upon in my earlier submission also is that within the government service, a majority of them would like to do a lot of good work. they will like to do a lot of good work. The only point is that they need a recognition, they need absence of a negative atmosphere, and they need a sense of competition and a healthy sense of competition. If you look at the improvement that has taken place in the management of the, say, aspiration district program, or also in terms of some of the indicators like health and education and water, because of the indices, and because of the gaze on these indices, and tell a state that, you are we are best in fast movement. You are not so good in fast movement. You were historically very good, but you're not presently good. The inner urge in a government servant gets stoked and gets, the improved. I mean, that's a sense of pride that you have in yourself, as the point that Professor Mamidi has said. You can leverage the sense of pride to provide a lot of improvement in the government service. That's something which is fairly important. A large number of people miss that because they feel that the behavioralism is only meant for the member of public and not for us. That's point number one. Second is that you look at the power of the collective majority, which is community. You look at the behavioralism as a behavioralism itself, which is a tool, can use the community power and community pressure as something which is a great asset. My senior colleague, Mr. Majid Sinha, used to say that if we have created the self-help group, we have created a huge social capital in rural India. Because self-help group is not simply an economic answer to handle the risk, but they are also to channelize the behavioral change in large number of people, because they feel that this is not possible if they are alone, but this is possible when you are in a self-help group. The similar example you can extend to VHSND. I mean, this is one of the Poshan Abhiyan, a very successful tool, where once in a month, large number of government servants congregate at a place and they ask the people, the women and children to come and join them and provide services. When you look at the chart of the number of people attending it, you will find that initially very less number of people attended. But slowly when you build the community pressure, and then you start seeing, if I'm a woman, I see my neighbor going, and my behavior changes because I consider that neighbor to be either role model or a matter for which I have to compete. Because I may not like her and say, oh, she's going, then I also have to go. Or if you like her, then say, okay, fine, she's going, then I will go with her. And if my child is, how can my child be not well and her child will be better? So this kind of the love, as Professor Mamidi says, disgust, love, or pride. So you can see all these principles working in this kind of thing. VHSND, I would say, is and the recent listing of large number of people, thanks to very efficient organization by many of the districts. The VHSND campaign is a very successful program. The third point I would like to say, and there I would say that there is a lot of work need to be done. And behavioralism also is a tool for us to generate the demand for the infrastructure that we have put. My case in point is Health and Wellness Center. Government of India and state government have invested a lot of money and resources in creating Health and Wellness Center. It's supposed to screen the population for many diseases, but we don't see so much of demand coming up from there. I mean, we are asking the civil societies, NGOs, and the block development officer, please reach every household and tell them. Now, this is something which is a pure question of behavioralism, that I know that there is something which is good for me. I know that there is a center which is good for me, but I really do not go there. It's like same thing. If somebody is on a pre-diabetic and tell him or her to get tested, say, no, I won't get tested because what's going to happen. You know fully well if you don't get tested, you will have a real problem. But you do it. There's a problem of it. These are classic problem of behavioralism. When the
Sorry, sir, I lost your voice again.
Yeah, it goes away on its own. So I was saying that for generation of demand for many of the services that government has been putting, behavioralism can come. If you ask me for low-hanging fruit, there's a huge low-hanging fruit for generation of the demand using the community pressure, as we have done in case of VHSND. I will take last example and invoke the name of the Prime Minister of India. He says that, you want to improve the nutrition of the just born child. So where do you tell the mother that she should feed the child in this way, and there is a 6 month of breastfeeding, and after that healthy food and all this thing? He says that when the women come just after delivery to the room, you put the television screen there. And there you say that what is good for the child and what is good for the mother. It is at that moment of time that your receptive power is the maximum. So, as I said, these design principles, now we have to put the television in any case. We have to put the awareness program in any case. We have to do a lot of ICE in any case. But why is it that if we do it intelligent and tell exactly at the moment when the person is more receptive on this thing, then that's going to work very well. So, as I said, there are numerous examples. The vaccination, another example that I would like to give is that the Pyramid Foundation working with us worked with the influence maker. Now, suppose I am a very respected teacher in the village, I am a respected religious leader in the village, irrespective of whichever religion I come from, I am a person whom everybody reveres. If I go to that person and say, look, I mean, immunization is not happening in your area, or vaccination, there are a lot of problem with vaccination, it's not happening. You ask this influence maker to just make the influence, make it once declare this, that this is done, or say a cleric or a religious leader himself first or herself goes and there and get themselves vaccinated, the rest of thing follows. So we have within the Aspirational District program, there are villages which were never visited for vaccination because people said that, or immunization, people said it's a bad thing. And when the team went for immunization and some people demonstrated, the leader of that village demonstrated that no, it's a good thing, then everybody else followed. So as I said, role model and intelligent use of the influence maker in changing the decision and this thing. Again, I would underline the point that the districts must have many great examples. I wish we had so much time to ask them to give the example. We have a collection, thanks to Professor Mamidi, on the success stories of using behavioral principle in aspiration district. That collection is in public domain. But I would say there are a large number of such stories where you can use it, and the last line is that it doesn't cost you money.
I completely reiterate Rakeshji's very important point, and that is, it's this othering of the public from the supply side, I think, is wrong. I think behavior science should, because at the point where the supply side and the demand side meet on the ground, which is where a frontline health worker meets the recipient of the service of a frontline worker, the cultural difference between the frontline worker and the recipient is actually zero. And given that the cultural distance and the economic distance and the political distance is zero, several of the interventions that you want to transfer to the demand side are also applicable to the supply side. So you have to treat society as a continuum, and I completely agree with him that working on the supply side is a critical feature of the application of behavior science for success of public policy. Thank you, Rakeshji, for
So we'll move to the final remarks. With the visionaries we have in our panel, I think I would like to ask both of you to share that how do you envision the role of behavior change in public policy 10 years from now? So probably I'll ask Rakesh Ranjan ji to start.
Well, let me start with the pitfall. The pitfall is that, see, behavioral science is so commonsensical also that a very large number of people think that they have done sufficient and everything has been done. If you ask them, have you looked into behavioral science? They say, we do it, we practice it every day in our home, we practice it with our own children, we practice in office. So what is so great? What is so new about it? But the pitfall there is that if you're very efficient as a district administrator or from the Joint Secretary of the Government of India, in any case, you will do a lot of job and a lot of good thing that you will do. There's nothing, I mean, if an officer is good and if a service provider is good, then they will provide irrespective of all problems. The success of a design principle is that you design a program for the laziest of the officer. I mean, people who are not motivated, you design the program for that. And that is where you bring the processes and institutional arrangement in place, because they will aid the good and nice officer and they will kind of motivate the officers who otherwise have some other concern but not behavioralism. So what is my vision? My vision is that how do we take it forward? And increasingly, we'll see the subject being referred, the subject becoming mainstream. Increasingly, you will see the demand on people like Professor Mamidi and their team to rise. They say, look, I've done so much in Vandit Matriti Yojana, but things are not improving. Tell us what. And it's a very painstakingly difficult science because you have to first find out what you have been doing. Second thing is that what you could have done. And third is that among the alternatives, which one is the best to do? And the fourth is you have to find out who's going to do that. So these are all four practical questions which every behavioral unit has to answer. Now here what I see is, and what my recommendation to everybody is, and this is a recommendation that this BIU unit of Nithyayog would produce a vision paper, as I say. It is say that every ministry of government of India, every district and every state government must have at least some designated officer who must have the responsibility as well as the aptitude to see the lens of all government intervention from a behavioral point of view, audit it and say that, look, this is what we have been doing, we are great, but we can improve it by this is a small thing. Unless you have a constant mechanism within the ministries, within the state government and district administration to take this forward, this will remain confined to the individual passions. And individual passions don't run the country. The country is run by institutions, in my personal view. So that is where I see in 10 years, if we actually succeed and if we see a large number of like-minded people, then this kind of institutional arrangement should emerge in the country. That's it.
So, very well articulated, Rakesh. I'm reminded of something that you told us about 3 years ago when we first started talking. And that was, you said, okay, you can design all your policies in the armchair, you can even test them. But however, when you finally give it away to the government and to the people, it should go away on its own steam. You can't be involved at that stage. And that point continues to resonate with me. Because there are any number of policies which get tested. You can use gold standards of art and so on, but they suffer in one major way, and that is they don't anticipate who are the people who are going to take that policy forward. And I think that's a very, very important point. And therefore, the idea that you have suggested, which is to have local officers who will, with whom you socialize the idea of behavior science, then becomes critical, so that the government itself imbibes behavior science and applies it in a systematic manner. So the institutionalization of behavior science in the supply side becomes critical to what you're saying. I completely agree with you, and hopefully that will happen within the next 10 years. In terms of where I see the role of behavior science in 10 years is slightly futuristic. India is a crazily diverse country. When you go to the south, you go to the north, west, or east, each village is a country in its own right. And the heterogeneity of context, the word context now comes in, then poses an immense challenge to us. It tells us that the science that you discover in Bihar may not be applicable in Gujarat. So do we reinvent science in Gujarat then to apply it there? And that's a pretty big question. This is the question that Angus Deaton, in point of fact, asks the JPAL people, and that is the external validity of what you study in one place. Does it allow for the portability of knowledge that you create in one place to another place? And that's a very important problem, and that problem is going to afflict behavior science as well. So now, how do we build in economies of scale to accomplish portability and transferability across contexts? And this is where I see the immense potential of AI and machine learning to come in. Behavior science cannot stay away from the application of big data and how that big data can be leveraged to then basically segment the country into smaller micro sections, which we sort of send out tailor-made interventions which will then change behavior. So you need a technological way of reconciling the diversity of India with a way of building knowledge that can apply to everybody. And that's and it's the marriage between AI ML on one hand and behavior science that I see a very powerful movement emerging as we go forward. And this is something that is being already demonstrated by the Amazons and the Googles and the Facebooks. They do have segmentation for the entire country, and if they can do it, why can't we? So this is what I hope will happen over the next 10 years, that we overcome the challenge of dealing with the diversity with a common science. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pavan. I would now like to close this panel discussion and just thank both of you for this very insightful comments. It was an absolute pleasure moderating this discussion, and we would now be taking questions from the audience. And as we see, there are multiple questions in the chat box. We will take a few, and the remaining shall be responded over the emails. And before I do that, I would just be sharing a link for feedback on the chat box, which we would request the participants who have joined, especially those who have joined in with curiosity on behavior change. We would like your feedback on this webinar, and since we would be planning further webinars, we would be glad to hear your feedback. So please do, before you leave, share your feedbacks in the form that you would see in the chat box.
Thank you very much.
So I'll just be posing certain questions, sir. So we have a question from Jagmohan Sharma, wherein he's asking that is NITI considering ministries, states and departments, governments as part of the program design to define the expected change process and criteria for evaluating a program scheme, which may be adopted to identify necessary behavior change channels at the design stage?
I mean, the answer is not so evolved, because we are supposed to have a task in our hand, and the task is that whichever are the poorest district, there are 15 central ministries where the Honorable Prime Minister launched it on January 22, apart from the Aspiration District Program, where the ministries were to explore, first single out the districts where they are not performing well. The programs are run in all districts, but some districts don't perform well. So the idea was that let us pick up the last 10 or 15 districts and see that why it is not performing well, and then do each and everything to improve the performance of these districts. Now, we have spoken to the district magistrates of these districts, and the first behavioral change that we have made it is that say it is possible. It's possible that you can change, and there is no reason that why you must be on the bottom of the 720 districts of India. There is absolutely no reason. The second thing that's happening is that within the ministry there are designated officers, joint secretary rank officer, and if you're working in central ministry, please have a discussion with them and use the tools of the behavioral science to see that how you can improve the performance of these districts. Because please remember, there is a lot of negativity involved in those districts, that I am on the last, and with these indicators, यहाँ तो कुछ नहीं होता है, यहाँ कुछ संभव ही नहीं है. So, as I said, that is the stand. Apart from this, the Government of India is also picking up very backward blocks for the district administration, and the same principle applies there as in case of aspiration district. If you are backward, why are you backward? There are n number of reasons, but one reason definitely, and one answer definitely, especially in social sector, is that the behavioral principles are not used to their potential. So that being the case, there is ample scope for everybody, but then it will not become very systemized. I will be frank outright with everybody. Unless you put an institutional arrangement, which is there in every ministry, in every state government, in every district, I wish it was true and it was done in the next 6 months. Then we could have many platforms where we could just look at a specific problem and answer specific questions.
Thank you, sir. I hope this answers the question. I'll move to the next question, which comes from the State Planning Commission PC division, wherein they are asking that which is more effective if we compare behavior change or with monitoring. So I pose this question to Dr. Mamidi if he can throw some light on it.
So it's actually an empirical question, but by monitoring, would he mean the government actively monitoring the process? I certainly would place it in the hands of monitoring, in the bucket of monitoring. I mean, you can't dispense with that. You need to manage the expectations of behavior science. But the government function cannot stop. Behavior science is beyond that. It subsidizes the cost of government function. So yes, I would say monitoring is critical. You can't dispense with monitoring and then depend only on behavior science to produce the change that you can't, for instance, stop domestic violence by using behavior science alone. You need law and order. You need police, right? You need to be able to file cases against perpetrators of violence to stop violence. But beyond that, you need behavior science. So in some sense, you need to use them in a complementary manner rather than as substitutes.
Yeah,
so
I would like to say the exactly, sir. I would like to say exactly the same thing. Why is it a binary? Why do you consider monitoring and behavioral science to be a binary? Because monitoring itself gives triggers to the behavioral change in some of the subordinates or some of the people who are working on the ground. And at the same time, you can use behavioral science to see, because monitoring, suppose something is getting stagnating, beside all your efforts, you have to ask a question and we have to ask the question, why is this not improving? And there the possible answer is that we have not put sufficient attention to behavioral science. So I think binary is unfortunate in my personal view. And as I said, binary would have been a good idea if you need money for both of them. You don't need money for setting the behavioral science unit in place. That's always the issue. It's a costless or a very marginal cost, very, very small cost.
Completely agree with Rakesh on this. Completely.
Great. So we'll take the last question, which is actually that Vartika Srivastava asks that behavior change in communication and information education and communication is included at the policy level, but she would want to know that what should be adopted to basically sensitize people about the schemes. So possibly she's mentioning sensitize and aware. So how do we build that base? So before that intent to action gap, how do we increase the level of sensitization towards schemes?
So let me dispel one notion. Suppose I am the person who is actually very dumb. I mean, not that it's very wrong, but, and suppose I am in a class and you tell me, you need a behavioral science, treatment, then I'll take serious offense. Behavioral science is not something that you announce, that I'm going to do this behavioral science treatment to you. What you simply do is that you weave it into the design principle of this scheme. Second thing what you do is that you weave it into the evaluation principle of this scheme. When you evaluate a scheme and say, why with my money I have not reached the outcome which I'm supposed to reach, there may be n number of regions. Behavioral science may not be one of the regions, quite possible. But my guess is that in India, at least at this stage where we are and the kind of the way we run this scheme, behavioral science still happens to be one of the prime reasons that why we are not doing well. In why we can further improve the impact of many schemes. So my view would be that if it is there in the policy, there must be somebody who is implementing the program must ask the question of behavioralism. You don't need this to speak to the people as such. You raise the awareness about the program and see that how people are behaving and take advantage of their desired behavior if your policy interventions are correctly designed. If they are not correctly designed, ask yourself the question. Not public. You say, why is your behavior wrong? You can't ask this question. Ask yourself the question that why is it that the public is behaving in this manner? And what is it that you have done that it is giving rise to that behavior? So I think more so that it is a kind of exploratory tool for people to understand whether the schemes is properly designed or not.
One thought I have is this relates to the dichotomy that we draw between communication, awareness enhancing communication on one hand versus other types of behavioral interventions. Sometimes it is possible to produce behavior change without even having communication. And one classic example that I can give you is, again, it goes back to the Swachh Bharat program. Take, for instance, the double pit toilet that Paramji implemented in Telangana first, which actually caught the Prime Minister's attention the first time. The double pit toilet is basically two pits. One pit gets filled up, and when it is getting filled up, it gives enough time for the other pit to decompose and become something else other than fecal matter, so that people lose their psychological inhibitions of disgust to deal with it in an effective manner. So the design itself, in some sense, the design of the artifact itself is, is structured using behavior science, and there's no communication involved at all. Placing healthy food at the eye level so that people eat healthy food is not a piece of communication. So there are ways of bypassing communication, bypassing awareness, and accomplishing the behavior change that we want. But certainly, communication is also important. So again, I don't see this dichotomy as a set of antinomies. I see them as working complementarily with each other. So I think you should use IEC, but you should also be willing to go beyond IEC to think of those structural, social, process-oriented innovations that can help us change behavior in society. Thanks.
With this, thank you, Dr. Pavan and Rakesh Ranjanji. I would now like to invite Dr. Radha Ashrit, Deputy Director General, DMEO Nithyayog, for her vote of thanks for this webinar.
Thank you, everyone, and it is my privilege to propose the vote of thanks. I would express my sincere thanks to Shri Rakesh Ranjan sir, Nithyayog, to give his valuable observations for this through this webinar, and he aptly narrated that behavioral changes cannot be equated to only awareness, and he clearly mentioned that what is the mechanism we can put in place through the policies as well as the schemes implementation, which can benefit the beneficiaries through the behavioral changes we can propose. And he also emphasized the importance of the institutional mechanism to be created so that the changes which we are planning will be actually happen in the ground level. I would take this opportunity to thank Dr. Pavan Mamidi, Director, Center for Social and Behavioral Change, Ashoka University, for his keen observations and remarks on the subject. He articulated that how the behavioral changes, the perceptions, through the lenses of economists as well as the common man, how we can look into that. And he clearly captured that how the all the expectations of the behavioral changes, behavioral principles are optimally we can capture in a scheme like Swachh Bharat. So he had articulated in a nice manner. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Shagata Mukherjee, lead Behavioral Insight Unit, for presenting the findings of the study. It is a big study, but you narrated in a very simple, lucid and interesting way what are the takeaways of that particular report in a very nice manner. That also in a very concise manner you have put it up. And I would let me also thank Bonu sir. He is the pillar of the DMU. He is actually supporting all activities like this, and he is always in providing overall guidance, leadership relating to undertaking the different types of events for knowledge sharing and knowledge gain too. I would also like to thank all the participants from the different ministries, states, districts, and institutions who gave their time for this event. I am so happy that this is one of our first events. We have a participation of more than 500 persons who participated through online. So my sincere gratitude to each and every one of you to participate in this program. And all my colleagues of this DMU, all their inputs, their support for making this event a success. Definitely, I would like to say that DMU is planning to make such more seminars, webinars, and interaction, so that the knowledge gained through various activities, processes, it will be reached to every one of you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's an honor. Thank you.